Okay, here to do a video on neuronal coding of information. And so what I want to do today is give you a couple of examples of how neurons use action potentials as words to sort of create sentences, if you will, right? They combine action potentials, right? And a single action potential rarely means anything by itself. It can, but it rarely means something by itself. And so we've got what we've talked about so far really is, I'll draw my sort of standard multipolar neuron here. We'll have it split more than one synapse. Right? And so, again, this cell would very likely receive input. Now, again, if it wasn't a multipolar, if it was a sensory neuron, these dendrites could be receiving sensory information through mechanically gated channels or temperature gated channels, a whole variety of different types. I'll have it receiving information from another neuron. And as we've said before, it's usually not a single other neuron. It's usually many other neurons. So I'll have different colors here coming in and synapsing. And again, right, the key here about whether or not this neuron in particular responds is all about the axon initial segment, just to review, right? And if we do reach the threshold of the voltage gated channels there, then we're going to generate an action potential which is regenerated, right, along the axon as a nerve impulse. Right, so we get an action potential, we get another action potential, we get another action potential. Again, cumulatively a nerve impulse. And of course, you know, we can put our target cells out here. Right, if we're getting action potentials along this axon and telodendria, then we would get neurotransmitter release at all of these target cells. It could be a single target cell receiving all three of these inputs, or 73 of these inputs, however many it would be. But oftentimes it is a group of cells, not a single cell. Okay, so anyway, the point being, the information that this neuron is going to provide to these cells is not coded in a single action potential. A single action potential was the mechanism of sending a signal along, transmitting a signal along a neuron, but it's not how the information is coded. The information is actually coded, and there's actually two possibilities for how it could be coded, and you might be familiar with these terms. Not a lot of people listen to radio anymore, or at least not the way I did as a kid. But radio, the information in a radio signal can be conveyed either by amplitude modulation or frequency modulation. So you ended up with AM or FM radio, right? And so when if we were to look at one of these action potentials, right, we had a spike like that. I know it's kind of small, but we got a spike, right? Amplitude modulation would mean that we would be conveying the information that this neuron is sending in the size of the action potential, right? The height of it, amplitude. That would mean that if you're going to convey different information, we would have to generate action potentials of very slight differences in size and magnitude. And then, of course, that would mean something, right? That an action potential that's half as big as another would convey something different than the larger one, right? The problem with that is that biological systems are not perfect. They do not generate action potentials that are all of the exact same size. They're very similar, but they're not the exact same. And so what you get is the effect of noise, meaning that variation, that slight variation in action potential frequency just because of differences in, ion fluxes and channel operation, that sort of thing, that it's very hard to use amplitude modulation just because they're already varying a little bit in size anyway. And so you don't want the information coded in the size if it can randomly vary. So what we actually use, biology, evolution has sort of selected, is frequency modulation. In that scenario, it's not the size of an action potential that matters, it's the rate at which action potentials are generated that matters. And so there's a couple different ways. The most common way, or the easiest way to explain, is that information can be frequency encoded. What that means is that this action potential frequency would mean something completely different than that action potential frequency, right? That's frequency modulation. Right? The information is conveyed within the rate of action potentials, not within the action potentials individually. And again, even if one were, I could make, one of them bigger than the others, some of them a little bit smaller, some of them a little bit bigger, it doesn't matter. Because the information is not encoded in the amplitude, it's encoded in the frequency. As long as the action potential actually occurs, it would be counted as part of the frequency. Okay, well that's one version of coding of information in the frequency. There's also something called temporal coding. And so temporal coding, what we're doing is the information's, it's a subtle variation on frequency encoding. So here we're just we're measuring this rate over time and then this rate over time and then observing that they're different. And of course, because they're different, they can mean two different things. Somebody squeezing your finger lightly would generate action potentials in the sensory neurons slower. Somebody squeezing your finger harder would possibly be painful, right? And generate much more rapid action potential generation, which means something different. It hurts instead of it's just, somebody's squeezing your finger. With temporal coding of information, what that means is that the information, yes, it's coded in the frequency, but it's coded in something more than that. It's coded in the change in frequency. So in other words, we get something like this. Right, where we go from slow to fast to slow frequency. Right, that's called temporal coding. And temporal means in time, right? So we're changing the frequency over time. Frequency modulation or frequency coding, it's literally in the rate. Here, it's the change in rate. And so what's important now is the change from slow to fast or from fast to slow. That's how the information is now coded. That's important because this could actually be much faster than this. With frequency coding, we have to the information has to be received over time so we can sort of average the rate, right? Because if one shows up, right, that's not a frequency, right? We have to sort of see how fast they're arriving over time. Whereas here, the change between this one, this span, and then this span, even this short little span right here, where we went from a long duration to a short duration between action potentials, that would be recognized as a change in frequency, temporal coding, and would mean something. Okay, there's another version, it's called population coding. I'm not going to try to draw a picture for it, it'd be hard to do. But what that means is that neurons work as groups to convey information, right? And so in that scenario, it's not a single neuron sort of generating a frequency or change in frequency, but it's groups of neurons acting in a population that is coding the information, right? And that's a much more complex, it's generally a central nervous system type of coding of information. But it is a really common version where the information is coded not in single neuron actions, but in multiple neuron actions, multiple neurons generating action potentials in groups, right? And that's population coding. Last one I would want to convey is something called spatial coding. So don't forget population coding. It's hard to put a picture on it, but it's groups of neurons working together in in spatial coding, we have, so spatial means, so temporal meant in time, spatial means in space. So in spatial coding, we have neurons, groups of neurons, innervating different targets. And what's happening, right? So in space, different targets, right? In space, so it's spatial coding. And what we can do now is we can activate these groups of neurons sequentially, right? Not all at the exact same time. And that actually means something. It's conveyed as information. This is a really common pattern that we'll see when we get to skeletal muscle. So in this scenario, we would have, let's say we had 3 different neurons, right? And when that skeletal muscle is not activated, well, let's say it's minimally activated, right? We would have one of the neurons, so this is neuron 1, this is neuron 2. I'll just give you 2 scenarios here. So this is sort of light contraction of the muscle, right? Neuron 2, let's have that one just generate like a single action potential. And the third one is not doing anything, right? So this is a weak contraction being generated. In other words, these 3 neurons are innervating groups of muscle cells, right? Spatially separated, right? So this neuron is innervating one group of muscle fibers. This one's innervating a separate group, and then a third group. So during a weak contraction, really only the first neuron and therefore group of muscle fibers are becoming active, right? So we're spatially coding the information such that only part of the muscle becomes activated. Well, if we need a harder contraction, we need to activate more muscle fibers, right? More cells within that muscle. So to do so, what we're going to do is we're going to start to activate the second group and maybe even the third group, right? Depending on how hard we need it to contract. So in our second version type of contraction, right? So this is the same 3 neurons, right? Now what you're going to get is this first one becomes more active because we're now trying to have this the muscle contract harder. The second one, right, is now active more consistently. And let's say the third one is even sort of throwing in an action potential here and there, right? And so this would be a strong or stronger contraction. Out of room down here. Okay, and again, that is what's called spatial coding. Remember, spatial means in space. So our 3 neurons are innervating target cells in different locations. And again, commonly seen in skeletal muscle control, where groups of skeletal muscle fibers are activated in bunches, in populations innervated by separate neurons. Okay, we've got frequency modulation. We've got temporal coding, or temporal, well, it's temporal coding. Frequency coding, temporal coding, when we have a change in frequency, right? So this would be delta frequency, right? Changes in frequency. We had population coding, where groups of neurons are conveying the information. And then spatial coding, again, where groups of neurons are conveying the information, but they're doing so to separate targets.